You're listening to CinePunked. I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson. This episode, everybody's in movies. Today, I'm still in California, and I thought, well, you know, I'm in town, so I've catch up with an old friend, and so we're joined today by Mr. David Del Valle, who is, well, best known to some of us as a film historian and critic and expert in all things Hollywood and cinema and horror in particular.
Well, Robert, the whole idea that we've known each other for all these years and this is our first face-to-face encounter is definitely enough reason to do this podcast alone, much less the fact that our interests are always the same. And hopefully you're going to do a book of my interviews from over the years, the print ones anyway.
Yeah.
And so we've been talking about that for quite some time. But are you enjoying being in Hollywood? Is it everything you thought it would be, or is it a little disappointing?
Well, I've only been here for a couple of days, so I haven't had the joy of seeing everything as I would like to have. But it's an interesting place. It's definitely a place of make believe and fantasy and fabrication.
Well, what I always found strange about Hollywood was that as much as it depends on tourism and its past and its affiliation with show business past, present, and future, they keep tearing down anything that remotely has historical value. Mm-hmm. To where when you came into town the other day, I was able in one afternoon to show you all the landmarks that were on Hollywood Boulevard, which were mainly the Egyptian Theater, the Chinese Theater, the Pig and Whistle Restaurant, Musso and Frank's, Amoeba Records, and a couple of other locations. Of course, we did miss the Chateau Marmont and a couple of things where more famous for celebrities dying, like John Belushi, etc. But otherwise, I think in 3 days you pretty much have seen our landmarks as opposed to, you know, other things, and film festivals and so on.
It's quite sad to think that Hollywood has gone that way, but then that's also fairly indicative of many of the major cities now.
I know.
Back home in Belfast, we were going through something similar, and a lot of what was there is gradually being torn down, pulled away, and abandoned.
Well, you know, progress comes at a price, and I suppose we shouldn't. I try not and become the curmudgeon that all of us do at one point or another and start saying things were better in the past.
Yeah.
Things were different in the past. I think there was a naivete, which I certainly see in movies. I have so many friends my age that will begin by saying, well, I only watch documentaries now. I have no interest in modern current movies because they're such rubbish. It's nothing but superheroes and bullshit. And, you know, there are great movies still being made, but I think you have to seek them out, and you can't let, you know, the public taste be your taste. Mm-hmm. You have to be individual. I think being individual, the one thing that's lacking in Hollywood right now is imagination, because we're trapped in a world of reboots and franchises and remaking what's already been made, and that is a lamentable situation to be in when we have such a wealth of fiction, horror fiction, weird fiction, science fiction, most of it, a good deal of it, in public domain, where no one is tapping into it. Must we remake Dracula every 5 minutes, or The Mummy, or Frankenstein, or reboot old 60s television shows? I mean, can't we move into material? M.R. James, classic writer. All his stories public domain. No one's doing them.
No.
I have to go way back to the BBC doing those wonderful Christmas ghost stories they did. They also rebooted Casting the Runes, that was made into Night of the Demon, Curse of the Demon. But I don't think there's as much interest in gothic horror now as there is, like, police procedural movies mixing with horror, you know. Jack the Ripper versus Sherlock Holmes is gone, but now it's Ted Bundy versus...
But then these things are always going to change anyway. Tastes will kind of ebb and flow. And obviously, if you look at what was going on in those classic periods of horror, I mean, there is a moment where that stuff is very much a flavour of the month.
Yeah.
So whether it be the Universal cycle in the 30s, which ends up descending into that mess in the 40s, or it's the Hammer films in the 50s and early 60s.
They all descend. Hammer descended. Tygon descended. Fox just got sold to Disney. I mean, I love the fact that Rocky Horror could now be a Disney princess. That's all kind of. But I think one of the things that's informing the decade we're in now is the fact that a lot of people, a lot of younger, the demographic for like 18 to 25, they're not reading as much as previous generations.
Yeah.
If you're not reading, when someone tells me Anne Rice is their favorite writer, I know they aren't reading. They're not reading. They're not reading much of anybody, are they? You know what I'm saying? It's like mass consumption versus back in a different era. When I look now, Roger Corman's having a birthday today. He's now 93 years old, and Roger made movies in the 60s, which are referred to as the Poe cycle, which began with House of Usher and ended with Tomb of Lygia. You look at those now, they're like fairy tales. There's nothing remotely... I mean, yes, there's subtext and so forth if you want it to be there. Roger certainly never stopped to think about those things. But they're like fairy tales. There's nothing remotely like the films like Hostel or Saw or the movies of today. And it's because we're in a different time.
But then Roger himself was a master of exploitation. I mean, he starts doing these films relatively cheaply, picks up on little things, and I mean, I talked to him a few years ago about his Poe cycle and about his work with Vincent Price in particular, and I mean, I drew a parallel between what he was doing and the stuff that Hammer was doing, because I think aesthetically,
well, they were definitely counterparting each other.
Roger will tell you that no, not at all. There's no connection whatsoever, but I think it's fairly obvious when you look at it on screen. There's certainly an aesthetic about the two that overlap. There's certainly a subject matter that's overlapping. But then I guess Roger's very keen on
if you freeze Roger for a minute and reopen the grave of Samuel Z. Arkoff, you'll see that all the horror cycles have to do with money. The fact that in 1958, when Hammer did Dracula, in Mexico they were doing Il Vampiro, in Japan they were doing one, and then Italy. It's so astonishing to me, a country so steeped in superstition and Catholicism. It took to the late 50s for them to get on the bandwagon of Gothic and Gothic horror, and it took I Vampiri, which was started out as a Ricardo Freda movie, and then Mario Bava was a brilliant cameraman, then was actually directing things, and he's attributed with a lot of I Vampiri. Then they gave him La Maschera del Demonio. But in 1958, 1960, you can see a horror revival in every country, and they all came out at when Hammer did the reboot of Dracula Frankenstein, they did it in Mexico, they did it in Italy, and then the United States, Roger, being ever so frugal, realized Poe is public domain. So was Lovecraft, but Lovecraft wouldn't become known until Roger miffed a little with the Haunted Palace and really did the Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Then Danny Haller, who was their art director, moved up to director and did what is arguably the first Lovecraft adaptation, which was Die Monster Die with Karloff. Whose house was being redecorated, so he loved being on this set. He said, I just sit here and drink my tea and wait for Evie to call me and tell me the workmen have left. It's not one word about the movie he's making at all, which I thought's hilarious. But in any case, no. And I mean, they didn't need to revive Dracula and Frankenstein. They had, the House of Usher, and they realized that with Vincent Price, they had the next generation Karloff Lugosi.
But then what's nice about what Corman's doing is that it's essentially a very American Gothic horror, fair enough, you got a bunch of Brits in the cast, but when you're looking at someone like Poe, I mean, this is an American writer rather than, say, Stoker, who's an Irishman, or Shelley.
Right.
they're taking something from the British are kind of doing the British stuff. The Americans are doing something that's decidedly American. Lovecraft the same.
But look how Hammer and AIP paralleled each other in the way they put these cookie cutter things together, because they are cookie cutter.
Yeah.
Of course, this would have been blasphemy when I was 12 and I was so in awe of all this stuff. But now, come on. First of all, you had Danny Howler, who redressed those sets to beat the band, where I used to count them by the blue and red candles in the different Poe movies. Okay, then you get Bernard Robinson over at Hammer that's redressing that same little set like mad. Yeah. I mean, these two guys were doing the same thing, redressing the same sets, revamping basically the same story. Because every Poe movie, regardless of the twists and turns, it's basically the House of Usher retold over and over and over again.
Sure.
The only time it got amusing, and Roger was like surprised, and he was the director, and I've sat with him in Q&As with this, in Tales of Terror, because that was a portmanteau, we did like The Black Cat, The Cask of Amontillado, combining them. And Peter Lorre and Vincent Price had this amazing chemistry together. So the wine tasting scene in that's totally satirical, and it's Poe, it's inspired by Poe, which is actually better, because trying to, as Roger will tell you, trying to translate Poe's short story into a feature film, or a poem like The Raven you can't do it.
No.
But you just turn in the tropes of duplicitous wives, revenge from the grave, premature burial, blah, blah, blah. Black cats and ravens, graveyards. It's all there. And then add some fog, and then have Vincent Price with his catalog of facial tics and vocal, which I did the commentary for the Tower of London, the second one, the one that he did, that Roger and his brother Gene did. And if you want to see a camp performance, watch Mr. Vincent Price play Richard III. It is absolutely, and this is what you pay to see.
Sure.
So, but at the time he was making these pictures, the critics were rather unkind to him, especially with his performance in Pit and the Pendulum, which now is it's an amazing movie, Pit and the Pendulum. I think, Pit may be my favorite of the Poe directed Poe movies. Everyone has a favorite, and mine fluctuates. Vincent used to say that Tomb of Ligeia was his favorite movie, but then Theater of Blood came out, and now that was his favorite movie.
Theater of Blood's great.
Theater of Blood's great. So are the Dr. Phibes movies, which also have eccentric deaths, showcasing eccentric deaths. But what's so spectacular about Theater of Blood is that there's no one better at killing off his critics with no better motive. I mean, just his reviews alone for Tower of London would have got the knives out, I think. But no, I do think Hammer and AIP were definitely in the market of selling horror, both local and internationally. And AIP started buying up European movies and releasing them, of course, which is how they got Black Sunday, and how they got, a lot of the Mario Bava titles like Planet of the Vampires and so on. But then let us not forget Amicus and Tygon. I had a special relationship with Tygon because I got to know Tony Tenser, who was one of the last of what I call the Wardour Street boys, these rough and tumble guys that look like they came out of Performance. Very, in your face, and, good old boys, and you're the Jack the Lad, and that was very much what Tony was like. And when I arrived in London, they were premiering Blood on Satan's Claw, or called Satan's Skin, and The Beast in the Attic, which had a great cast, but the movie was just a train wreck. But Satan's Skin, the minute I saw it, I knew it was a classic. And I went back, and Tony wanted to cut the scene where the skin's being cut off the girl's leg early. And if you're familiar with the movie, you'll know that's it's Tamara Ustinov. It's Peter Ustinov's daughter, I think, that's having this thing done. And I told him to leave the movie alone. Apparently, it was supposed to have been a anthology movie,
right? And
then it was decided to make it just one movie, which is why there are things in it that are never explained. Like the woman that's entertaining Patrick Wymark. She goes into the forest. We never see her again. So that story was like, the three connecting stories before the big payoff with Linda Hayden and the devil. But the music, the atmosphere, it's probably, I prefer it to Witchfinder General, which is not really a supernatural movie at all. It's historical.
It's a historical horror.
It's historical.
And a kind of proper horror in the sense that this is the actual horror of the world that
well, yeah, and it's a very unpleasant. It's not a kind of movie I would whip on shove in the DVD player just because I want to, like music. Because Witchfinder General is a decidedly nasty, ugly movie that contains a performance of Vincent Price that everyone will always talk about because it's atypical of what he was doing for Roger. But that was because he locked horns with a 23-year-old kid. And basically, the legend is that Vincent said, "I've made over 183 movies, young man. What have you done?" And Michael reputedly said, 3 good ones. Which is not true, because the 3 movies he's discussing, The Sorcerers, Revenge of the Blood Beast, or the She-Beast, and whatever he did on Castle of the Living Dead,
The Sorcerers is pretty decent.
The Sorcerers is a lot of fun.
Revenge the She-Beast one's awful.
Well, the She-Beast is that was made on a nickel.
Yeah.
And Barbara Steele was worked 19 hours nonstop, and that was it for her. But, there's charm in all those things. But see, it's a career it's incomplete. We will never know if Michael had done The Oblong Box. It didn't do much for Gordon Hessler, and I did it. If Mike had done, would he have been the great savior of British cinema? I don't know. There were 3 Michaels during this period. There was Michael Armstrong, that did Mark of the Devil and Haunted House of Horror and was a screenwriter. Michael Sarn, that was close friends with the editor of Films and Filming, Robin Bean. He made a few movies and then did Myra Breckinridge. And then there was Michael Reeves. All 3 of these Michaels have suffered career deaths of one kind or another. Michael Sarn was destroyed after Myra Breckinridge, and Mike Armstrong could not direct. And his writing, he lived with me for 8 months, so what do you do when you do that? I like Mike, but, he had a really rough time of it.
Yeah.
And Mike Reeves, dead of an overdose, or as they say in England, death by misadventure.
Yeah.
So who's to say if Reeves had lived, would he have been the new Don Siegel? I don't know.
So it would be very easy for us to chat here for an hour about our mutual love of horror films, because that is how I first encountered you, was reviewing. I think the first thing I did was I reviewed a DVD release of The Sinister Image. So your interview with Vincent Price.
Vincent Price, yes.
That came out on DVD in 2002. And then you were a regular contributor to things like Little Shop of Horrors. And there wasn't...
Psychotronic magazine was one of my favorite things to contribute to. Michael Weldon, I had so much admiration for, because he literally took what was a mimeographed newsletter and turned it into a magazine. And it was a great magazine, filled with outrageous 42nd Street flesh pot, grease, Grindhouse. He was doing Grindhouse before anybody. And then I did more print interviews for Tim Lucas at Video Watchdog than anybody.
So how did you get into... I would like to look more at your career rather than sort of the things that get you fired up.
Oh, yeah.
What got you into sort of writing about this stuff in the first place?
I was a monster kid, so I grew up in the 1950s, where if you wanted to watch horror movies, you saw them on television. So I was a very impressionable little boy of 7 or 8 years old when I first see the shock theater package of the Universal's Dracula Frankenstein, the first run of Karloff Lugosi, then the Wolfman in the 40s, and then right up to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And then I was an impressionable lad during the insect fear films of the 50s, and of course trying to lure people into the theaters when television was becoming so popular. And I was a child during this period, so I also was exposed to the horror hosts like Zachary, and I'm too young for Vampira, who was legendary by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, because she was in the very early 50s, and I was born in 1949, so I didn't really start resonating movies until like 56, 57, which was the heyday of insect fear films, science fiction. I saw Forbidden Planet first run. I had a little Robbie the Robot, which I still wish I had. And then I realized that these movies were more than just entertainment, because I was going through all the problems that children go through right up through puberty, which was, sexual awareness, feeling different from the others, being shy. Movies were a form of escape. And then, of course, when you're like 7 or 8 and you realize death exists, then horror movies become a metaphor for sex and death, the marriage bed and the grave.
No, we had a walk down Hollywood Boulevard the other day, and you did tell me a story about about the impact of death on you as a kid. I'd like you to share that.
Oh, well, when you're little, I think that parents give you little ducks and hamsters and goldfish so that you learn that death comes to all. Mm-hmm. But if you really think about the first time you realize that your parents are not going to be with you forever, and with me, I was like raised by my mom, so when I finally realized that she wasn't going to be forever, I was just like, I didn't know what to do. Unfortunately, this paralleled Walt Disney making 2 movies that are more horrifying than anything put out by Hammer or AIP, Bambi and Dumbo. Both films depict, in no uncertain terms, the death of a parent, but a mother. And when you're an impressionable little kid, and Bambi loses her mother, I lose my shit. And with Dumbo, it was even worse. So we were walking down Hollywood Boulevard by the El Capitan that's owned by Disney, and all they show is their product, of course. And Dumbo was the big thing. And I said to Robert, there's nothing on this earth that would make me go in and see a live-action version of Dumbo, because I was traumatized by the animated version of this fucker. So I'm never going to see him. And this is my problem, even with horror movies today. If cats or dogs or I just can't watch this stuff. Mm. I mean, there's a movie Mark Wahlberg did called Fear, and I thought it was really well done and everything, but there was a dog that's killed in it. And the minute that happened, I was out the door. And I just tell screenwriters and stuff, I said, look, you can sacrifice babies to the devil. I don't care. But you leave cats and dogs alone. So I think that the horror movies have always been cathartic for people. And for me, I just made such a career out of it, because when I was in school, horror movies were like verboten to a lot of, and I went to a Catholic grade school. So I remember getting in trouble for taking my fellow classmates to see William Castle's 13 Ghosts. I mean, of all Bill Castle's movie, if I'd take them to see Homicidal, I could understand getting in the principal's office, because that movie scared the shit out of me. But 13 Ghosts, really? And I got called on the carpet, and they said, you're corrupting your classmates, to which, as Russ Meyer would say, I'm glad to do it. Uh-huh. That's what Russ used to say about when they asked him if he ever made softcore. He said, I'm glad to do it. So, yeah, horror movies have always been very, very good to me. Uh-huh. And then by the time I got into college, which was in the early 70s, like 71, I believe, that's when I transferred to San Francisco State, movies in general were then being taught in college. Because I remember when there were no cinema courses. Mm-hmm. And I was going to San Francisco State when Hayakawa was the dean, and we had our first film programs in there. And among the faculty was a man named Dr. Leonard Wolf that did the annotated Dracula. And there was a poetry teacher there named Stan Lee, who was married to a lady named Anne, who was at home, drinking too much and worrying about the loss of her daughter. And she puts it all in a little number called Interview with a Vampire, which Leonard proofread. And I remember when Leonard was reading it, he said, this is going to be huge. And he was right. But at that time in San Francisco, not to digress, but there was a story going around that there was a very handsome young student, blonde student like Lestat, that was drinking human blood. And this was prior to them discovering that there were groups of people, pre-Manson sort of thing, that were drinking blood in ritual and stuff. But I mean, vampire, it's just bringing up that wonderful kind of what if which is what made The Exorcist such a phenomenon, was like, what if there really was a devil? What if there really were demons? What if? And that propels us into horror. Horror allows you to suspend belief. And I do think, being religious in some cases helps. For me, it doesn't, being an atheist, but which is why movies that get steeped down in Catholicism kind of turn me off, because, being repelled by crosses and things. That's why I like the Polanski vampire. He gets a Jewish vampire. Hey, have you got the wrong vampire? That kind of thing. No one likes Dance of the Vampires but me. Yeah, so my involvement in horror films goes back to when I was a grade school kid.
So did you say you studied film as well?
Well, I took the classes that were offered to me. At the time I was going to San Francisco State, we had James Dickey as a guest lecturer and teacher, and Deliverance had come out, and so he was really a big deal, but kind of insufferable in many ways. And he wanted to, forgotten who started the film studies program, but yeah, both in junior college and in college I took some film classes. But living in San Francisco during this period, my film school was Berkeley, the Telegraph Rep Theater. Telegraph Rep Theater that was in Berkeley is where I saw all the classic silent horror films, where I saw Caligari on the big screen, where I first saw Citizen Kane on the big screen, and then in Oakland I actually went to see Paul Linney's The Man Who Laughs on the big screen with Gaylord Carter at the organ. And that's the first and only time I truly realized how important silent movies were. Because when you watch them on DVD or you watch them in a 16, it's just, we had a screening of the Phantom of the Opera here at the Egyptian a few years ago, and they had a Blackhawk 16 millimeter. I couldn't believe it. It was so awful. And I even wanted to say to people before they watched it, because some people, I've never seen the Phantom of the Opera. Well, you're not going to see it today either, because this is an awful print. And the Phantom of the Opera is not a great movie. It's not. The only scenes that remain are the ones that Chaney directed himself. Rupert Julian's credited with directing that thing. And it's a snooze fest except for the key moments of Chaney confrontation, the unmasking, the blah, blah. But Phantom of the Opera, isn't it funny? The most maligned of all the Phantoms is the Terence Fisher Phantom of the Opera. And it's probably the best one. Because the Claude Rains is awful. The Chaney's not all that fabulous except for him. And the Robert Englund, let's not even talk about it. Did Argento do one? Yes, he did. Isn't that Julian Sands?
Yeah, I don't even recollect it.
It was about rat fornication, which I don't think was in Gaston Leroux somehow.
I suspect not.
But the Hammer Phantom has got a barnstorming performance by Michael Gough and a great performance by Herbert Long. Yeah. I don't know why people dislike it so much.
I think it's... So I personally, I think that there's this tendency within film criticism and film fandom to take the received wisdom of the experts of the past and then just to regurgitate it. So if you're told that this film is shit, that's what you'll go in.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point indeed, because if we look at, the classic story, Bonnie and Clyde. When Bonnie and Clyde came out, all the major critics hated it, but the French knew they were onto something, and the fashion industry knew they were onto something. And all because Bardot was going to do this with the fabulous Faye Dunaway looks and everything, which made Faye Dunaway, and Beatty for that matter. All the critics went back and changed their minds, which is unheard of. People like the New York Times going, you know what, this is a masterpiece. Well, everyone hated it when it came out. And I think with horror movies, The Bride of Frankenstein certainly became a classic in a hurry. And I've championed The Black Cat, the 34 version, since the beginning, because it's my favorite of the Universal horrors of the 30s. And then for the 40s, I like a little number called Night Monster, 1942. I would recommend that. Unfortunately, Bela Lugosi's given top billing, and he's just a butler, which is just shameful, but that's Universal for you. Having said that, I think that there's a tendency to... You've got, it's like Timothy Leary. Don't let people tell you what drugs are like. Take them, and then you'll tell me what they're like.
This brings us into sort of the way that you and I work, I guess, as critics. So, for instance, if I'm doing a review of something new that I've not seen before, I'll try and avoid reading any other commentaries about it until after I've watched it and written my piece, because I'm aware that I'm going to be influenced by whatever I read.
I'll give you an example of that right this week. I just saw the new Pet Sematary.
Okay.
All right, when it's over, the dust settles, and I go, why do I like it? Do I dislike it? It's kind of creepy, blah, blah. And I thought John Lithgow was great. So I walk outside, and they're all millennial kids, and they're going like, what? I liked it. The next morning, people I know and supposedly respect were like, this movie was shit. I was so disappointed. And I looked at who was saying this, and I realized that these were people that weren't going to like anything but the original.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this new Pet Sematary takes some liberties at the end with Mr. King's novel, but so what? Stephen doesn't mind, so why should I? And, well, why would he? This movie's going to make some dough, I think. But no, I think that there is a tendency to get on bandwagons, and I remember the night before I saw the new Suspiria,
mm-hmm.
I heard it was like an equal hate-love thing. So I went to see it, and I honestly did not know what to think, because you just have to dismiss the first movie.
Mm.
If we're talking remakes, and we bar in both cases, there are people that will prefer the new ones to the old, and people that will vice versa. I don't think anyone's wrong here. It's just a matter of personal taste. A movie like Mother, and this is another thing, Mother and the Lars von Trier, The House That Jack Built. If I believed everything people said to me online, it was like they were running screaming out of the Cannes Film Festival. This is too horrifying. Well, I've sat through Mother waiting to be horrified and run out of the theater screaming, and I was fine. And and then when it was over, I wondered, what was all the fuss about?
But you've worked in this industry long enough to know as well how it works and how the press kind of is manipulated.
But it's just out and out fabrication.
Of course it is.
I don't know what it would take to make me run screaming out of a theater. Probably shotgun blast or something.
I think I have only sat in a couple of films where people have left in droves. One was I went to a preview screening of Punch Drunk Love many years ago. Half the audience walked out.
Really?
Because it wasn't the Adam Sandler film that they were expecting.
Oh, well.
For me, it was a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah.
Because Adam Sandler finally is getting to act properly. And
he's not being an idiot.
And I like the mood, but literally people were just walking out in droves.
Well, that's an unusual choice, because I remember going into the Kellen Lutz version of Hercules. I was the only one in the theater.
Wow.
And the projectionist came down into the theater and said, "Excuse me, would we give you a ticket I would like to go home." And you're the only person in here. And I said, you know what? I want to see this movie in 3D. So you're going to have to go back up and show it to me, because I don't want to see anything else at the Cineplex today. And he was furious with me. But I was the only and I have gone to the trilogy of the 50 Shades of Black, 50 Shades of Grey.
Right.
All right, we know they're terrible.
Yeah.
But I have a girlfriend that loves to, go to these really bad movies. Mm-hmm. And she and her husband are like, he doesn't like them, so I go with her, because, I'm the token gay guy that she can go to these movies with. So it's always on St. Valentine's Day. All right, the Chinese theater, St. Valentine's Day matinee, first day, for all three 50 Shades of Grey. We're the only people there. She brings a riding crop. We take pictures of this S&M simulation in the lobby. We go and we've got our little drinkies and our little edibles and everything. We're going to watch these terrible movies. We had a ball. And there were actually, the second movie, there was like 2 or 3 other like-minded people in there. And we just made a party out of it. So sometimes, and they're really unwatchable. Mm. But I will say this, Dakota, what's her name? Dakota Johnson, considering it's a part that's unactable, she's amazing in it, because it's from you can't read the book. The book is like unreadable, unfilmable, unwatchable, and there we were. But yeah, I mean, sometimes someone's trash someone's garbage is someone else's gold.
So you've done a lot of commentaries over the years.
Yes, I'm a hooker. I went from doing things never mind. I've done Satan's cheerleaders. What have I got to?
So, doing this sort of the film criticism that you do,
yes.
you've So, I mean, I realise that some of our listeners maybe won't be so familiar with your name because you do work mostly within the realms of cult.
Well, not anymore.
But also, you're very US based, and so because we're based in the UK, there will be people who listen to this.
Right. Well, in the UK, I've done a number of DVDs for Arrow, Olive, and 88 Films. For 88 Films, I would highly recommend these three titles: Grizzly, The Toolbox Murders, and Tobe Hooper's Invaders from Mars. Because from 88 Pictures, I did exclusively for them 3 30-minute interviews with my reflections on Tobe Hooper for Invaders, Cameron Mitchell for Toolbox, and Christopher George for Grizzly. And they're unique because they're not audio commentary. They're reflections of me for talking for 25 minutes. If you can understand, you can imagine me talking that long.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I
I actually talked without taking a breath. Someone said, but for audio commentaries, I started out doing just Vincent. Well, the first audio commentary I ever did was for William Lustig, the director of the Maniac Cop movies. A great guy. And Bill asked me for his company Anchor Bay if I would do Harry Kumel's Daughters of Darkness with Delphine Seyrig and John Carlin. So I got John Carlin, or rather Bill did, and John Carlin and I did a commentary because I love Daughters of Darkness. It's one of my favorite lesbian vampire movies. And that was my very first one, and that was back in 90-something. Since then, I've done about 65 commentaries. Lately, I've done a Ginger Rogers movie, The Magnificent Doll, about Dolly Madison. I've done Father Goose by myself, Cary Grant movie. I've done The Detective with Frank Sinatra, 10 to Midnight with Charles Bronson, Anastasia with Ingrid Bergman, The Barefoot Contessa with Ava Gardner. I've done... with Eric Roberts, I've done Runaway Train, and I worked for Canon. I've literally done every genre now, but I started out in horror. And I just did Ordeal by Innocence for Kino, which is an Agatha Christie. And what else have I done? I just did Kiss of the Tarantula, an unwatchable Texas movie that I watched. I did one called Don't Look in the Basement, and my only thing to advise anyone was don't. Just don't look in the basement. Don't open the door. Don't open the window. Just don't.
So when you're doing one of these sort of things, are you looking at it purely from a film history point of view? Are you looking at it in terms of the text of the film? Are you looking at it in
I go to the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy, and if they don't have anything on it, then I get truly desperate. And I think of it in terms of... you can't... the worst commentaries you can do is where someone just goes to the IMDb and every time an actor walks on the screen, you rattle off their credits.
Yeah.
If you're going to inform... And I like to do commentary where you've invited David Del Valle into your apartment, and if he's not, smoking all your pot and drinking all your booze, he's watching the movie. And kind of like the League of Gentlemen kind of thing. But no, actually, because I do have a background in film history, and it does... bode me well when I'm talking about these movies. I don't like to prepare scripts, although I have done so. And I understand now with companies like MGM, they demand to have approval. So in other words, you can't just waltz in and do it, even if you script it, like Tim Lucas does. They still will look at what he's doing if he does something for MGM, as will all the rest of these people, whether it's my friend Lee Gambon or, the usual suspects, as we call them.
Yes.
Prior to being incarcerated. I've done... Father Goose was an experience because I went down to the Margaret... I didn't know what... because I'd seen the movie, but it's not my particular cup of tea. But I found Cary Grant's script that he had annotated little notes in, and I began to notice that Cary loved to X out his dialogue and give it to other people. Not because he was being generous, he just didn't want to do any work, He's a lazy sod. So it's like Leslie Caron has all these speeches that were all his, and he said to the director, you know what, she's doing such a great job, give her this. So all of a sudden, it began to take flight. Then I read Diane Cannon's book, where Carrie was dropping acid and doing Father Goose, and all of a sudden, this movie became rather fascinating to me. So and I got good reviews for it. So yeah, I mean, I will prepare, of course. I think it helps enormously if I like the movie. But I, like everything else, like when I started collecting photographs, I used to collect photographs that I admired and wanted. Now I collect photographs that someone else might want. So it's the same,
It's funny, 'cause I always find the best reviews that I ever wrote of anything were the films that I hated the most.
Well, let's see what people think about Don't Look in the Basement.
The ones I like are okay, but you eventually run out of things to say, and it's always just, yeah, this was great. But the stuff that you really hate, to do it properly, you have to really get into why this is a bad production on all sorts of levels, and it often offers you a chance to be a little bit more clever, I guess.
Well,
the most unclever way of arguing that sentence.
The best audio commentaries I've done, I did one with the late Nick Redman for Theater of Blood, and that was a great commentary because it came from the heart. I did a commentary for both the Dr. Goldfoot movies of Vincent Price, and I had my friend David Dakota as my moderator, and the movies are awful, but we just had a ball because like Vincent would be doing something and Dave would go, "She's on fire in this scene." I had so much fun with that. And of course, when the reviews came out, they said, well, the movies are terrible, but if you listen to them with these commentaries, it's very entertaining. And so when they, it's like if they give you lemons, give them lemonade. I try and be entertaining. And the scholarly academic side of me, whatever that may be, kind of like, if there's something to inform, I will inform. I think with the Vincent Price titles, and I've done about half of his catalog, the ones where I have personal knowledge. I mean, the only commentaries I feel bad I didn't get, for example, The Black Cat, 1934, the Lugosi Karloff. I could literally do that commentary right now, but I don't know that I'll get to do it unless Arrow does it. Cruising, I would love to work on. I don't necessarily mean I'm the world's greatest authority on it, but I love the movie. And I know they need a commentary with Billy Friedkin, and then, maybe there'll probably be 3 or 4 because Arrow does such great work. I've done a number of things for Arrow. Their Dr. Phibes box set, their Blood and Black Lace, their Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, the Tower of London, and their 6 Gothic Tales, that box set that's so beautiful. I did commentary on The Haunted Palace and forgotten what the other one was. I've done so many. And I just won a Rondo last year for best commentary on Dario Argento's Suspiria. And I'm up this year for The Killing Kind, Curtis Harrington, that I did for Vinegar Syndrome with my friend David Dakota. And I want to win that, so people should fucking vote for me. What's wrong with you people? Don't give it to those limeys, give it to me. But anyway, yeah, I mean, there's no pattern or recipe for how to do anything. I think you should approach each project with whatever it is about it. You can bring something to the table. Obviously, when I'm doing something like Ginger Rogers' Magnificent Doll, I actually found a connection with that. You know what? When I lived in Palm Springs, Ginger lived in Palm Springs, and my mother used to buy her old cast-offs that she was selling through a little boutique in Palm Springs.
Wow.
So I actually went out to Ginger Rogers' house and met her. And there was this doll sitting on a table, and I remarked, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "It's a prop from the movie I did on the life of Dolly Madison." And who would have thought, sitting in that air-conditioned house in the desert like 30 years ago, that in 2018 I would be doing an audio commentary for that very movie. So you see, life is, I've been very lucky to have met so many people that have long since passed away. Like when I was in high school, I met Lillian Gish. If I want to make people think I'm 100 years old, I said, "You interview Lillian Gish?" "Yeah, I interviewed." No, I didn't interview D.W. Griffith, but I did interview Lillian Gish. But she lived into the 70s, so I'm just regret I'd never met Peter Lorre, although I would have been 11 years old. It wouldn't. Let's see, 64. Yeah, I would have been like 13.
Yeah.
But I still would have had stuff to say. I did get a phone call from Boris Karloff when he was in Hollywood just a year before he died. And I didn't think it was him. So I'm like, he's having to explain to me that because I go, I can do that voice. He went, well, I'm sure you can, but I am Boris Karloff. And
what was Karloff phoning you for?
Well, I was doing a local horror show called the Bob Wilkins Show, called Creature Features.
Okay.
And Bob and Harry Martin, who was the newscaster, went down to Hollywood from Sacramento to do a day on the set of a TV show called The Name of the Game, which starred Gene Barry, Robert Stack, a bunch of people. It was filmed at Universal. Roddy McDowell was one of the guests, and Boris Karloff was the other. So Bob goes up to Boris Karloff and says, I have my buddy in Sacramento, David, loves you beyond anything. Would you call him? He just adores you.
Wow.
And Boris says, well, of course. He calls me up and I go, who the fuck is this? I didn't say that, no. I didn't swear in those days much. And but when I realized it was him, I just was just like nearly in tears. It was just like, oh. And he invited me to come down and watch him tape the Jonathan Winters show. And I couldn't make it. I couldn't raise the money to take and the airfare back then was like, round trip from Sacramento to LA was like $30.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any money. And I was just like, I regret this to this day. I could have spent the afternoon with Boris Karloff and Jonathan Winters and Agnes Moorehead and whoever else was.
But I mean, to be fair, you have had
I can't complain.
You know, I mean,
I cannot complain.
I've listened to your name dropping the last few
Well, you know
days,
what? And I want to address that. One of the criticisms I get on my commentaries is that I name drop. Mm-hmm. But if you know someone and you're friends with them, is that still name dropping or what?
And if it's relevant, which, I mean, whenever you mention... I say it flippantly because I know we have
but I mean, I get this... No, yeah. I mean, I get a review that I name drop. Well, you know, there was one person that didn't... What was it? On the Vincent Price interview that I did with him, which is universally applauded for one reason or another. Someone said, well, David talks too much. Well, you know... Let me just put it this way, you know, I've done over 65 of these sons of a bitches, so I must be doing something right. And I keep getting employed, so what can I say? And the people that I think are detractors are jealous. That's the only thing I can think of. They're just jealous that I've... You know, it's one thing, I noticed on Facebook, people take pictures with celebrities.
Sure.
But they don't know them. They've just walked up to them at a meet and greet and take a picture. And I have friends that have thousands of pictures with everybody you can think of, but they don't know them. Some of the people that I talk about, like Vincent Price or Christopher Lee or Michael Goff, I knew them.
Yeah.
I had dinner with them. I hung out with them. It wasn't just and even sometimes if I've just spent, like you would do with an interview with someone, you can build a rapport with somebody that you've interviewed, or not. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think who the worst interview I ever had was, it was a non-interview. It was Telly Savalas.
Right.
And actually I had a good time with him, but I wanted to interview him. I think it was for Tim Lucas or something, and I met him at the hotel up at Universal City. And we met in the bar, and we chatted for a minute, and he said, well, I have to have at least $500 to do an interview. And I said, well, that's nice. He said, well, obviously you're getting paid. I said, no. He said, let me get this right. You want me to do an interview. You're not getting paid. I'm not getting paid. I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to buy you a drink, and we're just going to sit here and talk, and fuck both of them, because you shouldn't do things and not get paid for it. And I'm your Dutch uncle here. So, I mean, how can I be angry with him? I didn't get the interview, but it was certainly great advice to sit and have drinks with Telly Savalas and have him tell you that your employers are shits and you shouldn't be doing this. So, I mean, that's my... See, I have a story for all...
Do you find that that's something that still happens now? So, I mean, we're...
All the time, are you kidding?
You know, I mean, I certainly would still... I'd probably have more work if I did more stuff for free.
Well, here's the deal, Robert. When you first met me, or even before that, when I first started, I did a lot of stuff for free.
Yeah.
Because that's how you build your
name,
your brand. But, 40 years later, when someone says do this, it'll get your name out there. I have to say,
it's out loud.
I think my name's out there. I mean, I'm kind of trying to pull it back a little in some cases, but no, I mean, look.
So, which is the point at which you go? I mean, it's advice I think for anyone who's working in this industry.
Yeah.
There is a point at which you should stop doing the freebies, and when is that?
Well, I think when you're 60. How's that for a beginning? Definitely maybe before, maybe when you're 40. No, I think first of all, it depends on the project. It depends on your connection to it. For example, I shouldn't say this, but I will. I'm so crazy about, being part of this Friedkin cruising experience that I would waive a fee to work on it.
Sure. Yeah.
But, Arrow won't hear this, so we won't even know that. But no, but I mean...
Arrow, they may listen.
No, don't do pay me, but let me just show you my sincerity. No, but I mean, some of the movies that I regretted not getting, they just put out The Strange Door. Richard Stapley was my next door neighbor, and he's the star of that movie. So who should be doing the commentary on it? Me or somebody that didn't know anybody? And I follow that through with every title, whether it's a Curtis Harrington title or a Vincent Price title or a Barbara Steele title. I'm not saying I'm the world's expert, but I can give more than just an educated comment on their work, and I think that's important. There aren't many of us left that had these experiences. So I think while we're around, we should be taken advantage of because, the day will come when there won't be anyone. I mean, I've been doing these Return of the Living Dead tributes until I'm down to 6 people because Jimmy Caron's gone, Toby Hooper's gone, Dan O'Bannon's gone, George Romero's gone. It's so funny. They're all gone but John Carpenter, and he's the one that everyone predicted would die first. He's never going to die. Well, not that he should, but I mean, eventually he will. Yeah. But, he won't when anyone expects it.
No, after I get to meet him and interview
him.
Then...
Yes. Well, look at Roger. We're just celebrating his birthday today, and he's in his 90s. 90 is the new 50, probably, maybe.
Well, Roger is, quite spectacular, and what a legacy of films that he will leave behind.
Well, I just wrote a little thing about him on Facebook, and I said, well, I've been a fan since House of Usher, and then I thought, well, no, I've been a fan way before that. I mean, before I really knew who he was, I had seen The Wasp Woman, Not of This Earth, Little Shop of Horrors, Bucket of Blood, and I loved Dementia 13 that he didn't direct, but he certainly was responsible for putting it together, and The Terror. I mean, when I first moved here, I have one poster I will never sell, which is this half sheet for The Terror, because I got Jack Hill to sign it, Roger to sign it, Dick Miller to sign it. The only one that hasn't signed it is Karloff, and it's because he's no longer with us. But there's a movie that's legendary because it was shot in 3 days, apparently, and everybody worked on it, and it was... Karloff was on it just long enough to pay back what he owed Roger. And I understand from everyone, when he went back to England, Karloff would say, never mention the name Roger Corman again, ever. And they never worked together again.
Wow. Can't have been good then.
No.
No.
The Raven and the Terror.
Yeah.
But Karloff did a number of pictures for AIP, as many as he could before he got sick.
Yeah.
I know The Curse of the Crimson Altar. I did the audio commentary for that with Barbara Steele, and then sometimes when I do a commentary, they'll port it over to something else. For example, I'm on the 10 to Midnight that Scream Factory just put out because the commentary that I did for Twilight Time got ported over. Which is,
You must have done stuff back in the Laserdisc days as well.
Oh, I did.
Yeah,
I worked for Image. I worked for Image Entertainment, and I did all the Poe liner notes and provided the photos. And then when they did the Tomb of Lygia, and I'm not going to take credit for this particularly, but I may have done the first audio commentary period because I recorded Elizabeth Shepard and I watching the Tomb of Lygia in my apartment on just a little portable tape recorder. That tape has been on the Laserdisc for Tomb of Lygia and 2 of the DVDs of Tomb of Lygia.
Wow.
And Elizabeth Shepard got mad at me, and we've been friends for years and years and years because she thought I got paid for that. I said, Elizabeth, we did it for nothing in my apartment. So how would I have gotten paid for it? And then she thought that Image paid for it. I said, honey, Image doesn't pay for anything. At least not. I mean, they paid for liner notes, but they're not going to pay. I had begged them to put it on because I wanted to preserve it. And even though the quality wasn't that good, you have to remember the year I did that. Elizabeth remembered more that particular year, 30 years ago, than she would right now.
Yeah.
So, but that was the first one, and that is on the Laserdisc for Tomb of Ligeia. I did Master of the World, Premature Burial. Then I did Mars Needs Women, and I got a hold of Tommy Kirk and did a phone interview with him. I did Burn Witch Burn, and I did a phone interview with Janet Blair. And I also, Sidney Hayers and I were friends, so I got quotes from him. But we didn't do an audio. I begged Janet Blair to do one, and she wouldn't. And she was living at the beach at the time. So yeah, I started in Laserdiscs. And the very first documentary I ever did was The Horror of It All for Gene Feltman that came out in 1983. And that was narrated by Jose Ferrer. And I got Ruben Malmulian, Curtis Harrington, Martine Beswick, Ray Bradbury, John Carradine. They all appear on camera in that. It's not a bad little documentary. I've done several since.
So, bearing in mind we're going to have to wrap this up fairly soon, what are you proudest of?
I'm proudest of my interview with Vincent Price. I think I'll be remembered for that. And I'm very proud of some of the audio commentaries I've done, especially Theater of Blood, Blood and Black Lace, Suspiria. I'm proud of the books I've written, Lost Horizon, Beneath Hollywood Sign, Six Reels Under, and the soon-to-come-out Del Valle of the Dolls. And your book, that'll be 4.
That'll be 4, well, possibly 5.
Yes, 5.
I think we were 3 books we talked about at one point.
I've definitely...
Two of them
actually, when I moved here, back in 2013, when I came back to Hollywood, I famously said, as I checked into this little bed and breakfast that I lived in for 4.5 years, I have no more stories. All the great stories are behind me. There's no interesting people anymore. I lived in that apartment building 4.5 years, and I now have a whole book just on living in that building with all the crazy people, because I was living between the Academy Awards and the Magic Castle, right on the corner of the most notoriously wicked city in the world. And what a fool I was to make such a stupid remark. And I now realize that you have stories right up until the day you die.
Yeah.
And you can just, and that's the way one should look at it. And it's just me being a lazy writer that I don't. I just did a foreword for one of those EC comic collections. And I'd never done a comic book before for Dark Horse Comics. So they wanted me to do crime suspense. And I chose that because I love film noir. So I said, well, I'll tie in film noir, because I had to be from a film point of view, because I don't know comics that well. So I was sitting there, and I, of course, waited till the deadline to turn it in. So the night before they absolutely had to have it, I'm sitting in my little apartment in my room, and I'm staring out of this brick window in the center of Hollywood, and I realize, here's my story. As I sit in the Amour Arms, the moon is filling into my apartment, and of course the Black Dahlia had lived in my building. So it just flowed, as everything does when you're put up against the wall. It's the way I wrote my college papers. I had a year to write one, and I waited till the last. Anyway.
Nicely way we get on.
I mean, I cannot work unless, if you give me a month, 29 days later, I'll start on it.
Yeah.
But with that, so I'm kind of proud of that. And my documentary work, I did a documentary for a really talented guy named Mark Hartley, who lives in Australia, called Electric Boogaloo, The History of Canon. And I've been getting more attention from that. And I must say, I'm really proud of it, because he interviewed over 200 celebrities. And I mean celebrities: Sharon Stone, Richard Chamberlain, Jean-Luc Godard. And I'm in that more than they are. I'm in the trailer. So, my advice to anyone is never say no to anything until you really weigh what it will do for you. I can tell you examples of where I've done something for free. When it's presented, it then got me work. So don't just ever say no unless you're being paid. if you and I had done that, we wouldn't be where we are right now.
No.
Because I've done a lot of stuff for free in the past. But when you're not a professional until you're paid for what you do. So the first time I ever got paid for a magazine article, I realized, now I'm like H.P. Lovecraft, because he was like lived off those magazine things. Of course, I'd be being paid the same thing he was in 1937, like 50 cents a word or whatever. But no, don't say no to things. Always weigh the possibilities. And, the biggest thing, and I would say this to even the most famous, the most lauded film directors, have one person in your entourage or in your circle of friends that will tell you the truth. Because what's wrong with movies today, when I go to cast and crew screenings, which I shouldn't go to, especially if they're new movies, because I sit there with my arms folded wanting to say, this is shit! And I can't do it because it's a room full of people that are like, they're completely in a trance over making this awful... Anyway, so I'm sitting there like, I can't say what I mean, and I'm lying through my teeth. But if that filmmaker had had one person in his entourage that said, you know what, maybe you should rethink this, or this isn't so awesome. But if you're always telling that everything is awesome, everything isn't going to be awesome. And I'm the one that has to fucking look at it. So my advice is have one person that will tell you the truth. And listen to them. Your ego should not be like a shield that has no penetration at all. Somebody has to get to you so that you don't just make stupid... I wish someone had done this with me on a number of life issues, But sometimes it's good to make mistakes. But on the other hand, I could have certainly benefited from not making so many mistakes.
I think that's a good point to leave it. I think that's good advice, and I don't want to sully it with more. Ta-da! So if people want to find out more about you, David, are you available on social media these days?
Yes, I'm on Facebook, and you can also reach me through sinisterimage.com. What's my other one? Del Valle Archive at gmail.net is my website, where the Del Valle Archives. I have about 30 pieces on that I wrote. I used to do a law, but when I first moved back here in 2013, I did this. I would write something like when the Argento Dracula came out. I wrote, that Dracula was now a greeter at the Olive Garden. Welcome to the Olive Garden, because I hated the Argento Dracula so much. So I started writing these pieces, so they're all there for you to see, and I just haven't written any lately.
I'll stick some links up on our website as well, so people can find you on these websites. And you
can find me currently at VCI Entertainment with Kiss of the Tarantula, Don't Look in the Basement, Blood and Black Lace, Ruby, and I'm leaving out something, but I'm sure they'll remind me. Ordeal by Innocence, Killing of Sister George, Female on the Beach, from Kino Lover, from Vinegar Syndrome, my Rondo-nominated The Killing Kind, one of Curtis Harrington's sickest movies, with my great friend David Dakota. And I've got 4 or 5 more lined up after that, and a documentary on male nudity.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I'm just so glad we finally met face to face. Well, in my little pied-à-terre off of Weston,
So just to finish this up, David's apartment is crammed full of horror memorabilia and stuff he's worked on. It's quite a sight to see.
If you see there, hosted by me, that House of Wax, that's why that's up. It's my name. My name's on a movie poster. What more could I ask for? And to have autographed John Waters in Divine. There's the other spectrum of grindhouse cult that I love.
Fantastic.
And my landlord makes shadow boxes. So now I have Trog and The Mummy and The Black Sunday. And,
brilliant.
And the second version of Lolita, because I got to meet the actress who played Lolita in the remake with Jeremy Irons. I forgot his name. Anyway...
David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
And hopefully we'll have you back on at some
point. I would love it.
My thanks again to David for tour guiding me through Old Hollywood and for opening up his home just off the Hollywood Boulevard for us. Remember, you can find out more about CinePunked, including our publications and live events, at cinepunked.com. You can follow us on our social media channels. We're CinePunked on Facebook and Twitter, and CinePunked Film on Instagram. You can download our back catalogue of podcasts via the website or your podcast provider of choice. And we hope if you've enjoyed this episode, you'll subscribe or consider leaving us a review on iTunes. Until the next time, I'm Robert J. E. Simpson. Thanks for listening.
And you got yourself a show.
Got myself a show, that's it.
Got yourself a show.